I'm talking about the motives for religious unbelief, for skepticism. And I want to go all the way back to ancient Greece. And in doing this, I'm relying on an interesting book written by, well, a friend of mine, a professor of moral philosophy. His name is Benjamin Weicker. His book is called Moral Darwinism. And he begins the book not with a discussion of Darwin, but of the ancient materialists. Who were the ancient materialists? Well, they were guys like Epicurus, Democritus, and Lucretius. Now, Democritus is the guy who sort of first postulated the idea of atoms. Democritus had no evidence for this, but he sort of made it up. But he said at the smallest level, I think everything is a small particle. And these small particles are all that exist in the universe. Now, leave aside the rather interesting, I would say, coincidence that Democritus proved to some degree to be right. But Democritus's point was that there is nothing other than these atoms. He was a materialist in that fundamental sense, and so were Epicurus and Lucretius. Now, what's interesting is that when you probe why they found this materialist philosophy so interesting, they fess up. And they fess up and say, in effect, we don't have proof of any of this, but the reason we like is it gets rid of the gods. Wow. Here is Epicurus. He says that I want to remove the idea of immortal souls and, quote, remove the longing for immortality. So he seems to recognize that immortality is something that humans, as part of their nature, aspire to, long for, and he's like, we got to get rid of that one. Lucretius says he wants to remove, quote, the heavy yoke of religion. Why? Because he says religion saddles human beings with ideas of duty, of responsibility. To come back to Epicurus, he says that the idea of the gods creates, quote, anxiety, anxiousness in human beings. I suppose that's because gods threaten to punish us for our misdeeds, both in this life and in the next. And Epicurus says, well, yeah, if there's another life that comes after this one, there could be some suffering in that life. He doesn't know that there is, but he says there could be. And so he goes, the good news about having a purely material reality is we don't have to worry about any of that. We can focus kind of on pleasure in this life. Now, when we say the word pleasure and the English word Epicureanism sort of means the pleasure-loving life, and we might think that Epicurus was some kind of a wild hedonist, crazy parties, drinking, orgies. But no, Epicurus, in fact, wasn't like that at all. He was what we would call a little bit of a hermit. Why? Because Epicurus said, look, there is pleasure and then there is pain. And so if you want to maximize pleasure, one good way to do that is to really focus on minimizing pain. And Epicurus said that when you undertake a risky life, an adventurous life, a lot of times things fall out from under you. You get injured or your plans get blasted to pieces. And so you then experience a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. So for Epicurus, the way to maximize pleasure in life is to have a high degree of self-control, to eat very simple food, essentially to rely on the simple pleasures of eating modestly and sleeping. So Epicurus was more concerned with minimizing suffering, what he calls freedom from disturbance. And Epicurus says that even when you die, it's kind of a nice thing. He goes, because our soul basically, not our soul, but the atoms in our body, they kind of dissipate and there is no soul to kind of experience this, oh gosh, life has come to an end, or to endure the consequences of a life to come. So here's Epicurus developing, you'd have to call it a purely naturalistic philosophy, naturalistic as opposed to supernatural, in order to liberate man from what he saw as the tyranny of the gods. And Lucretius is pretty much in the same camp. If you read Lucretius's long poem, which I haven't done in 30 years, but nevertheless, it's a poem celebrating nature. And Lucretius in that poem talks about, quote, unloosing the soul from the tight knot of religion. And so Benjamin Weicker, the author I mentioned earlier, sums it up. He goes, a materialist cosmos must necessarily yield a materialistic morality. And then Weicker goes on to trace a very interesting connection between these early materialist philosophers and the Darwinism of the 19th century, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. How Darwinism itself is weirdly appealing to naturalists and skeptics and atheists, even though it would seem to put forward a very repulsive idea of human beings reduced to the level of the beasts. But the good news from the atheist point of view is that if humans are reduced to the level of the beasts, well, guess what? One of the things that beasts don't have is morality. Beasts don't follow an external code of morality. There's no 10 commandments for the monkeys or 10 commandments for rats or for deer for that matter. Essentially, it's nature all the way. It's a naturalistic instinct that drives beasts. And so if human beings are beasts with nothing special, no soul, no distinguishing feature, then ultimately human beings too become liberated both from religion and from morality.